Delicate subject. Chapter 12. By the time they left Palaven, everyone had a room and a bathroom. The shuttle bay and engineering lost a lot of redundant dead space, and Miranda gave up her ostentatious office. Tally installed better filtering in general and specifically in her quarters, resulting in a much healthier Tally, who seemed to have had low-key chronic infections that she fought off daily. Double-checking, Karen had verified. Damn it, Tally. In Garrus's case, since they were on Palaven when the work was done, he got a Turian shower, which involved alternate fine particle blasting and then air blasting. Who knew? She couldn't ever get in it because she'd leave bleeding, missing skin and possibly eyes, but he was very happy. Water was not a Turian's favorite thing, and getting it under plates was not that much fun. He'd still use her shower, but he said having the Turian shower kept him from feeling vaguely slimy. Ew. Yeah, nobody wanted to feel vaguely slimy if they had a choice. His hide changed in texture from rawhide to suede, and his plates were buffed down. He said he felt civilized. Although she wouldn't ever classify him as slimy, or even vaguely slimy, she was glad he was happy. She'd have to wait for the opportunity to use the "go to your room" line, probably on Grunt. His room was big for obvious Krogan reasons, and when he left, that room could house a few people with some modular furnishings to make the room compatible with non-humans. She beefed up security, more shielding, with the idea that indoctrination might be transmitted. She expanded the brig to include shielding. There was a guest cabin now. Diplomacy and rescue might require it. They'd picked up a few getting-started missions. Not terribly heavy-hitting, mostly fetch and carry or investigate out in Terminus, where the Asari and Turians theoretically didn't have things happening, but where things were happening. She'd choose a few things to do and get them done quickly, then head for the IFF. Everybody on her ground crew had asked for, and gotten, a favor, and she had a team unlike any she'd worked with before. Whatever she did here, whatever happened from this point, she'd made good use of her time and effort, and she was proud of herself and her team. Thane was back in the mid-bay, only temporarily, and not life-threatening, something to do with studies on immune factors and systemic sensitivities. There was a lack of Drell medical history, his in particular, and Drell in general, since it came up that he'd had a great deal of surgery and alterations as a child, and his medical history was non-existent. They were going to try to reconstruct some of his specific physiological circumstances before attempting to translate his treatment into research for a more general populace. It was not as though they could put in a request to the Hanar for a list of procedures he'd received. Add to those facts that he was biotic, and good luck with your study group, guys. Karen was also concerned that Thane was in pain he was not discussing, and wanted to monitor and find a way to compensate. Yes, please. Thane was always in pain he was not discussing, so the chances of that being true were 100%. Garrus had a new wonky schedule since he was coordinating with the hierarchy as a main line of pursuit after being available for ground teams. The Normandy was on an Earth schedule of 24 hours a day, and he was on Cypertine time, 28.3 hours a day. The Thanix was ready to go, and anything that needed to be done could be maintained easily. His words, not hers. His schedule didn't coincide with hers any longer, and he spent time with Tally, spent time with Thane, and spent time with her. Good thing Turians didn't need that much sleep. She still spent time with him every day, but not always during her sleep schedule. It varied. Today she'd spent a few hours with him during her late afternoon, a constant and reliable comfort in a man who could make her laugh under dire circumstances. With dance practice over, which she missed, she was back to her regular schedule, workout and work and maintenance. There had been a final night before leaving Palaven of buying lots of alcohol and food to celebrate new galley and new rooms, which was mostly spent with people grabbing bottles and plates and heading to those rooms to celebrate. She did her job and got to sleep at a decent hour. She had nightmares. She had always had nightmares, and they'd gotten progressively worse, moving from fear of the unknown to remembrance of the known. Thresher maws were a common theme. Gasping for non-existent air and historically accurate freezing to death from the lungs out visited often. Being bound and blinded was another. Amid all the other horrors of her day-to-day, nightmares were the most mundane with the least real impact, and she didn't grant them any power over her. She was rarely alone in bed any longer. Reverie made nightmares blessedly impossible, but she needed time alone for centering, balancing, and finding herself again after being swept away repeatedly off knees that no longer functioned. With years of compartmentalizing practice, it wasn't hard to do. She made a conscious gear shift, one she made several times a day between maintenance, work, mayhem, pleasure, and sleep. In the middle of giant race of mind-stealing, slaughter-prone, unknown sentience, and I died, ask me how, the translated horrors of her life and imagination as told by dreams couldn't hold her attention for long. She didn't grant nightmares any meaning other than her brain rummaging around for crap to worry about, holding it up to the dark, examining it under surreal conditions and the inability to process. She dreamed of Garrus, dead, because that would hurt, and it would be her fault. She dreamed of Thane betraying her, dark eyes gone cold, with one of his knowing, terrifying smiles playing on his face. Because that would hurt, and if it happened, she'd blame herself for betting the wrong way when she knew that his warmth and love came with warnings that came with prices. She was accustomed to dismissing dreams as soon as she woke, no more meaning than the dark behind her eyes as she slept. Part of her. This time it was a dream of bonds, helplessness and pain, clawing herself to consciousness. Realization of being awake dispersing the shock quickly. Her heartbeat slowed as her mind came under her tenuous control again. It would recede soon, back under the waves, the shape fading to a splash and then a shadow, ripples dissipating reassuringly. It would be gone, and that was one of the beauties of waking up from nightmares. She was always grateful to be awake, that it was in fact over and done, and that easily dismissed. Thane wasn't there, and then he was. In the twilight of near waking, she accepted his presence as though it was a natural part of trading the known past pain for the current mystery, the price of waking. She was an infiltrator, but she required mechanical and technological help to disappear. He had the ability to inherently cease to be visible at will, and she accepted that as well, not encroaching on his secrets. She didn't like to ask questions about what he could do in order to respect his privacy. Also not wanting to find out that he maintained that skill by some vile and occult method the Hanar had taught him while flaying his soul away strip by excruciating strip. What she felt about his skills was not envy, but apprehension and empathy for the costs. He stood in a darkened corner of the room, and she heard an echo in her head of him saying, You have less control over your responses when you first wake. It should be terrifying, but it wasn't. It was comforting that he was here, watching over her. The sense of internal threat was higher than the sense of external threat, and that was terrifying. She watched him, and he watched her, both with shrouded eyes and too many questions with no voluntary answers. She hoped she didn't talk in her sleep, but didn't want to find out because there was nothing she could do about that. The truth wouldn't help. A lie wouldn't help. She could make up something believable, even recount another dream, something vague and random, something about being indoctrinated. She didn't want to. Trying to unsuccessfully reassure him that he could help her wasn't something either of them needed if they were seeking truth. She also wasn't going to ask how often he was here when she didn't know it, because that also didn't really matter, and if he did it every day. Okay. Good. She could use a new, terrifying normal that was also comforting. She closed her eyes and lowered her head back to the pillow on her side, accepting and willing to try sleep again, this time with rest as the result. She had done this often. It was the same in theory as when she missed a shot in target practice. She tried again, and again, and again, and eventually she would hit more than she missed. Even if the target got progressively smaller and farther away. Distinct but low, she heard him start to hum, the sound of drill empathy and acceptance. She was surprised for a moment that she associated the sound with Thane. It used to belong to Urim. Urim would like Thane. Urim would love Thane. They could share the hum, passed along like a torch. A new, terrifying normal. As though he were approaching a wounded animal, he came slowly closer, until his lips brushed the hair at her temple. His fingers passed, feather-light over her fist, until her hand relaxed. She fell back asleep to the sound, and didn't feel when he left, or if he left. She'd decided to handle a mission from Thessia. Hera Tegist was a member of Thessia's influential matriarch hegemony, and her daughter had disappeared. Other avenues of investigation were being followed, but one of her possible destinations was in the Terminus systems, and it was best if commandos were not sent or found there. The Normandy could help by checking out a destination potentially occupied by slavers. Other than the name Shepard, the Normandy stealth drive was their biggest draw. Once it was proven that they had the capacity, they became the first choice team for rescues and infiltration. Offers were coming in. What they had not mentioned, but Thane uncovered, was that Hera's daughter, Misalat, likely was the leader of the slavers. She had not been kidnapped by Vakarians. They were her crew. Shepard decided that with that being true, even with Hera knowing it was true, which she likely did, Jane would return her daughter alive, along with whatever evidence they had on her, to her mother, making it clear as a dual wish and threat. I hope your daughter is never found with slavers again, as her life would be in danger. She looked at it this way. A chance to kill slavers. She was always up for that. She, Garrus, and Thane were the core team for these outside missions, as they had chosen to stay, were consulted for the planning stages, and she didn't want to risk other members of the team who had signed on purely to stop the collectors. Tally and Garrus spent 2 days monitoring in orbit, able to work out how to disable security and keep potential hostages safe. Kasumi was kind enough to locate Misalat's bank accounts, drain them, and set up funds to help resettle approximately 250 physically and psychologically traumatized people from multiple species, including Asari with high-tech biotic suppression collars, in civilized zones where their own governments could protect and provide for them. There were male and female Taurians, humans, some children. There were even a few Solarians, opening up negotiations with the Dalatrass on their safe return. Misalat had not wanted to be taken alive, but without backup, she was only one Asari, and she didn't have the options she wanted to have. Shepard got her dart tranked and down before she was getting up to full steam in her narcissistic monologue rant. The only words Shepard spoke to her were, "You don't own people." Rage, as a word, did not cover what Shepard felt, and she would have done this mission for free. She might have paid to do this mission. Palaven and Earth were grateful. Shepard had taken a personal moment to speak to Misalat in the brig and tell her that if Jane ever heard she had stepped out of her mother's compound, she would make it her personal mission to track her down and put her down. She expressed the profound wish of inflicting every wound she had seen on the captives. Garrus told Misalat he'd placed a tracker on her that she'd never be able to find, that ensured he'd always be able to find her. It wasn't true, and that just made it better. She hoped Misalat spent a great deal of time trying to prove a negative. Thane never disclosed what he had said, but Misalat never spoke a word after that meeting took place. Shepard delivered a haunted and silent Misalat to her mother, wearing a biotic suppressant collar, along with a large container bearing the nauseating number of other collars they had found, and recharging apparatus. Shepard suggested leaving it on, and only agreed to hand her over to her mother and not Thessia's law enforcement if she agreed to keep her in the residential compound for her lifetime. Hera agreed. Hopefully, with all her people dead and no start-up cash, Thessia would have a permanent, resentful resident under the thumb of the formidable woman whose ambitions and influence she had almost destroyed. She'd theoretically be biotically helpless, terrified of a tracker she could never find, and Taurian retribution, haunted by Shepard's and Thane's threats. Fitting. Shepard had smiled and wished her a long life, almost hoping she'd try to leave. Thessia had provided promises of support, a great deal of tech and provisions, and a lot of cash, official and unofficial, supplemented by Kasumi's plundering of a criminal network. They were rich. Helping out Taurians was a medication run to a contested area. The colony had a new strain of virus that had been isolated, and a vaccine was available. But Batarians had determined that by blockading the system, the planet would be free soon of live Taurians. Speed was required to obtain the cure from a Solarian medical outpost. Their stealth needed to run the trade blockade and avoid outright war. Last-minute job, low risk, high payoff, just like she liked her missions and rarely got them. Gratitude resulted in a lot of produce from colonists. Garrus's and Tally's descriptions of the food made Jane wish she could eat dextro. There was cackling and a minor whiff of gluten. Okay, hearing Garrus describe food, Made her hungry. And thirsty. They also prevented the potential deaths of Turians that could now defend themselves and push back the blockade. That did not suck. She'd upgraded as much as she could. She'd done favors and set up the machinery of execution, and it was time to execute. Her to-do list had been done, and they went to get the IFF. Now she had the IFF, and her biggest question was, why the fuck was a Geth there, and why does it talk to her? Secondary question, why does it have a piece of her armor? Back on the ship before activating the Geth, Garrus had argued against it. Tally was not amused. Both Jacob and Miranda had argued against it, which was more easily dismissed. The idea of handing over greater advantage to Cerberus was not something she was willing to do. A talking Geth was a potential advantage. Yes, also a potential detriment. So what happens when it plugs itself into the Normandy and takes over? I'll say I'm very sorry. Garrus was close to growling. She wasn't taking it as an insult to her judgment. He was trying not to make it about her choices and more about potential consequences. But those consequences were not unanticipated, and he was not offering solutions. Why would you trust a damned word it said? A Turian once offered to help me, but why would I trust a Turian? As far as I know, Turians have killed more humans than Geth have. Thane had added, why would a human or a Turian trust a Drell? I am a proven liar and murderer. Garrus glared at her. I'm going to run every single test I know on that thing, and I'll be in the room when you talk to it. He let some menace slip into his voice, and she kept it out of her face that she was more turned on than upset as a result. Thane added, I also would like to be there. Nobody has declared trust yet, Garrus. It is enough of an anomaly to investigate. I can't wait until our investigation boots our curious asses into extinction. He left, either to punch something that wasn't them, or to run his tests. Possibly both. Jane looked at Thane. He did say, our. I am certain that is comforting to him. Edie, once our Geth friend is awake, I want priority surveillance and zero access to live processors. Can you create a shadow network that mirrors the Normandy systems but has no real-world connection? Allow entry to those systems, model the outcome. I will grant verbal authorization, but I don't want to make it too easy for him. I will appear reluctant to allow any access. All orders regarding access to systems will be authorized to shadow access only. Counterfeit high-security information and systems placed in dummy locations. See if it attempts access. See what it's after. Yes, I can do that. Acknowledged. You could have done that while Garrus was in the room. Why spoil the surprise? He wasn't asking me, he was telling me. Edie, I want the IFF activated to the model systems only. Track its impact. Simulate outcome. The IFF has not yet been integrated. Would you like me to begin when ready? Yes. Run simulation at will. When Legion wanted them to help him rewrite a hub of Geth, Garrus was, again, still, possibly eternally, displeased. She'd agreed to help Legion, and she was thinking about how to approach it, able to work out now in a small gym space that had been put in with the renovations. She was working on kicks and strikes to a target dummy when a frustrated Garrus arrived. He looked like a Taurian Hamlet to her, brooding and scheming, trying to figure out how to get his way. He stood behind and to the side of the dummy, looking at her with that predatory edge that she loved in him. She told him, "I know you're trying to figure out how to get your way, but it's not going to happen. Even without Thane here, I'm doing it my way." But, damn, you are unbearably attractive when you're angry. I should give you fair warning. If you stay, there's a risk of being licked. Remember that one time I passed up angry drill sex and I had immediate regrets? Thinking of remedying that with angry Turian sex. His arms crossed over his chest. I could just go make Thane angry, have angry sex with him, brief you on the results. You're cruel, you know that? Seriously, though, if you do that, don't let my disappointment stop you from actually briefing me. He stepped forward, moved the dummy out of the way, and took its place. You know that's called a dummy, right? Are you apologizing? He shook his head and threw a punch, a slow one for him. She dodged it, and then he started speeding up. She picked up the rhythm, blocking and throwing her own strikes, adjusting to her new dummy. He was more reactive and therefore a better workout. She went with it. She expected him to carry out his threat to have her down in 4 seconds, head spinning. But he continued with measured practice. So, if I understand correctly, you're taking this Geth and going with a team into a Geth ship. He landed a powerful strike she couldn't block to her hip. And installing some unknown code. With a feint and then follow-up, he landed a kick to her upper thigh. She got it. The man was stressed. She had an ampule in her arm, proving she didn't know how to take him down under normal circumstances. She had to hope the dart penetrated hide and didn't get stuck in a plate, and that he wasn't wearing a helmet at the time. Very small window of opportunity, very low odds of success against him. She smiled and went a bit more on the offensive, landing a strike to his abdominals. He hadn't asked a question yet. She waited, focused on the physical aspect of play sparring with a 7-foot-tall, suavely angry Turian. He was pulling punches, keeping it in the realm of sparring, but his eyes and voice implied a tip-of-the-iceberg understanding of what he was feeling. He wanted to prevent unnecessary disaster, and she sympathized, but his definition and her definition of unnecessary were 2 different things. This was necessary because her instincts told her so, and she could not explain that rationally. Thane seemed to comprehend the curve of that intent, and that was reassuring, but nobody else seemed supportive. As long as they did their jobs, enthusiasm was optional. A few more minutes of sparring, and she had renewed respect for the fact that he gave nothing away. His eyes were steady on hers, and his strikes were wherever he wanted them to be. The reverse of dancing. Disconnection and impassivity. She had seen him fight hand to hand, but rarely. They often never got into melee at all, both expert at ranged marksmanship, pride in never being touched, and picking off targets before they got close enough to attempt to do damage in return. Seeing that focus directed at her was... She was too much of a soldier to not be impressed, too much of a leader to not be grateful she had this man on her 6, and too focused on being his lover to not have that push her just a little bit further into wanting him. She was in no danger of changing her mind, so this time was for him. She approved of him beating her up. She approved of him speaking his mind. It wouldn't change a damn thing about her opinion, no matter how well he did those things. She'd have to rely on the mechanics of Taurian stress relief being as advertised, sex and violence doing the trick. Too bad for him that he hadn't discovered anything she didn't like. This was one of the farther-flung aspects of freedom, having options. He couldn't deny her his presence and hope that would work on her. He knew better. He couldn't convince Thane to turn on her, angry sex or not. Yes, please. Angry sex. He still hadn't asked a question. He was a very smart man and knew her well, but sometimes Garrus's heart beat so loud he couldn't hear anything else. She loved him for it. She didn't want him to change. He had not necessarily learned to listen to what she did not say. Thane was much better at that. The sparring was measured and calculated. He was pulling punches, coming to her level of ability and maintaining a balance slightly in his favor, but not too much. He wasn't roping a dope either. He did not want to do her harm or demoralize her. He was fighting because this is what Taurians did when they were stressed. So he found her when she would be most willing to fight. He had let the silence hang long enough that he knew she wouldn't be drawn into explanation or exposition. She wasn't the best at hand-to-hand, but it did take him some focus to avoid her progressively more complicated strikes and counterblows. He said between her strikes, "What I want to say about that is..." She evaded a sweep to the knee, but missed the further momentum of his body, resulting in a hip throw, with her down, flipped over onto her stomach, hands held behind her back in one of his hips straddling hers. His mouth was at her ear. "I'm going with you." She had not been expecting that. She turned her head to the side, spit some hair out of her mouth. "You got mutiny backward, Vakarian. You don't offer me support." He shook his head and squeezed her wrist. "I'm not offering. I'm telling you. I'm going with you." "So what stops you from shutting him down and knocking me out 5 feet through the airlock?" "Spirits, you're devious. That's an idea I haven't had. That's how mutiny goes, you say?" "Think I should try it?" "I do not. It was just a... for instance." He leaned down, his tongue at the nape of her neck. "I'm just giving you..." He squeezed her hands and nipped at her shoulder. "Emphatic warning that you should plan on bringing me, or I figure out how to go on my own." She hadn't thought about it much, but her immediate instinct was to bring Thane and leave Garrus behind. He wouldn't have had trouble figuring that out. "I don't know. It seems a bad precedent to set for ship-wide discipline to have someone just tell me what to do." He leaned into her. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. It's also apparently bad ship-wide discipline to sleep with your subordinates, but I'm not complaining about that. I don't see why you would complain about this." "Well, I'm not exactly complaining. And you're not exactly a subordinate." His talons moved to pinch her ass, and she, yes, squeaked, but it could also be considered a yip. "You're not agreeing, either." "I was under the impression I didn't need to agree." His pinching hand moved to cup her ass under her workout shorts. "No, you don't need to. But I would like it if you did." "So, you want me to prevent a mutiny that would result in more support for me by conceding to, let's face it, a fairly reasonable demand, huh? Yes, but don't call me reasonable. Things could get ugly. Garrus, my face is being ground into a mat. It can't get much uglier from here. Now that's just insulting. All right. I'm bringing you. And Legion. And Thane. You can watch Legion, and Thane can watch you. And Legion and I can do our damn jobs. Tell Thane to watch Legion, and you have a deal. It's not a deal, it's an order. In that case, yes, ma'am. Let go of my hands. Pfft, that I'm ignoring. I should explore the not exactly subordinate thing. Door could open any second. No, it's locked. There's no lock on that door, Garrus. There is now. And I'm the only one that can open it, so if you want to get out... The man planned ahead. Well, if I can't use my hands, you have to use yours. Is that an order? She mimed banging her head on the mat a few times. She's cracked under the stress of command. On the bright side, as second in command, I can take over. Imagine a creative threat. A very creative threat, right here. I don't have it yet because I'm uncomfortable, and just threatening to hit you would not be enough. If you leave me here, I will take a great deal of time thinking of and executing that creative threat later. We chuckled, and the warm vibration of it moved down her spine. Have I ever told you how good you smell? How very distracting that is. Long before I was ever able to touch you. Your scent has always made me want to step closer, breathe deep, lose myself. Sometimes it's hard to concentrate. Right now, you smell like sex and combat, and that is irresistible. He licked at her throat, huffing breath, sliding his hands over her back, under her shirt, his scent rising in the air, and the combination of his scent with hers, strong and evocative of all the other times he'd touched her. He sat back, shifting his hold on her hands, but not letting her loose. He pulled her hips up until the mat was pressed against her shoulders, and she was on her knees. His tongue and the tips of his teeth were on the back of her thigh. If we're all going to die because of your curiosity, at least give me a memory I can take with me, Shepard. We're going, and we're coming back, and I'm starting to lean toward replacing the particles in your shower with powdered sugar. Don't fuck with my shower, woman. She tried to yank her hands away, but they didn't budge. His other hand shifted the fabric of her shorts and underwear aside, and his tongue was on her. Inside, the feel of his growl on her skin and in her spine, and the only answer she had was a whimper that widened into moans as his hands pushed more fabric aside to stroke at her clit. The inrush of pleasure and reverie made her start to pant, and she wanted to say, "Garrus, I'll take you everywhere. Please don't stop." She didn't say it, but damn, she wanted to. She even wanted to mean it, and she bit her lip to keep from saying it. He squeezed her hands together, pressed down with them, and pulled them back, then forward, creating a rocking of her hips against his mouth, the thrust of his rough, textured tongue curling inside her. Her shoulders started to tremble, then her thighs, and her helpless slide into heated, slick pleasure was emphasized by the strength of his hand around her wrists, his purring hum from his plates pressed to her. Everywhere. When she came, his hand and tongue rode those sensations through shocks, creating aftershocks. extending a burst of pleasure into a streaking comet. He pulled up and back on her hands, and she was lifted and pressed against his chest, his hand shifting cloth aside, tight and binding around the slide of his cock into her. Her gasp led to a shriek. His hand turned her face until he could kiss her, and she bit at his tongue until she tasted blood, bit at her own, and leaned back against him. His hand tightened convulsively until she felt the bones bend. He pulled down on her arms and drove into her deeper, twisting, rending, spinning mid. And he would go with her everywhere, even or especially if it was more dangerous than he thought they could handle. He mutinied in style. He held her suspended, crushed back against him with his hand roaming over her breasts and belly, thighs, fingers holding her helpless and stroking more pleasure from her growls and moans on her mouth. He was blind in force, and she was never afraid because the instincts that told her to walk onto that ship were the same instincts that told her that she could trust him. He would never do her harm. She loved him and would never have to question that decision in a lifetime of choices. After rendering her entirely boneless and weak, when he tried to put her back on her feet, her knees predictably could not hold her. He released her hands and held them in his hands, fingers twined, leaning her back against him at an angle impossible for humans, bearing her weight. Well, that went well. I should do that more often. Powdered sugar, Garrus. I'll make you lick it off. That's supposed to stop me from doing it? His laughter was warm, soon joined by hers.